Okay, so we should be recording now. Hello, welcome back everyone. For those of you who have been following us on a regular basis, whether live or on our YouTube page. Again, my name is Kira. I am the Substance Use Prevention Coordinator for City of Somerville. Today's training is going to be a little bit different compared to what we've done in the past couple of weeks where we've been focusing on one particular substance. Today, we're actually going to be talking about anger management and how that kind of coincides with substance use. This is a topic that actually was suggested to me by a couple of people in the community, so thank you for that. And again, like we've done in the last couple of presentations, if you have questions, please submit them to the chat box. We will go through them at various different times in the presentation, and we will also have time for Q&A at the very end of this. And we will also have a couple of interactive moments as well, so I will be interested to see what people kind of come back to me with. So let's get started. Oh, okay. So just a couple of training objectives for tonight. We're going to be looking at anger, impact of substance use on mood, a little something called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. I'll get more into that later on. Anger management techniques, triggers and warning signs, resources, and like I said, time for Q&A at the end of this. So what I'd like to do, this is going to be our first interactive moment for today's training video, is just kind of have us all stop for a second, and I would love if people could just type into the chat box anger. When you hear that word, when you see that word, what are some of the first things that kind of come to mind? And again, if people can feel free to just type that into the chat box. And I'll give people a couple more seconds. Okay, so we have a couple of really good answers here. From one person, I'm seeing, just having an emotional overload, not being able to control your emotions. A couple of other people are saying irritability or bad mood. One or two people are mentioning yelling. One person also mentioned the color red, which is very interesting. Okay, definitely things that we tend to associate with anger for sure. Let me just close up this chat box again. If we look at the dictionary definition just for a second here, before we start exploring some of the things that people mentioned, we can define anger as a strong feeling of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility, which in some ways is a relatively, in my opinion, tame definition for an emotion that is so extremely powerful. I think we've all experienced anger at one point in our lives or another, and we all know from personal experience how overwhelming sometimes it can actually feel to be angry. And there's a couple of different interesting reasons for that. So there are a select group of human emotions that have been with us now for thousands of years. We kind of tend to call them the more primitive or primal emotions that come from the human brain. And those emotions tend to be things like fear, panic, and also, for today's discussion, anger. All of these very old emotions are actually very, very closely linked to our survival instincts. Some people in our audience might have heard of the term flight versus fight, which now in 2020 we've kind of modified a little bit to include flight, fight, or freeze. So this is a survival instinct that happens when we find ourselves approaching some sort of dangerous situation. You tend to do one of three things in those moments. You either run away from the danger, you either stand there and fight what it is that is going on that might be causing danger, or, especially with a lot more of the modern day instances of what we find to be dangerous, you might just simply freeze in place. And anger, as we can see here, or as we might presume, is probably most heavily linked to the fighting instinct. Fighting takes adrenaline, and anger is certainly a producer of that. It gets your body moving, it gets your mind working, it gets you to stay in a place and try your best to survive instead of just freezing. Now, here are a couple of other questions that we have popping up here. As a therapist, one of the things that I often do work on with clients is the difficulties around identifying anger as a negative emotion. most of the time these days, we tend to put emotions into one of two different categories. We either refer to them as being positive emotions, or we tend to refer to them as negative emotions. And before I move on to the rest of some of these questions, again, I'd like to turn to our chat box and just kind of ask, again, as a follow-up to some of the things that we had asked about in the first interactive question, for people, when you think about consequences and actions and behaviors that are related to anger, what comes to mind for you? And again, I'll give the audience just a couple of seconds to start chatting in the chat box about that. You can also feel free to message me privately if that would be easier for you. Okay, have a couple interesting ones coming in. So I am seeing legal problems, workplace issues, conflicts with relationships in your life, whether it's with strangers or people who you're closer with. I'm also seeing the word violence. And I think I see one or two other people who are also just mentioning the word aggression. Okay, so the thing that is interesting for us to think about when it comes to anger is anger actually a negative emotion? Most emotions have the ability to carry you forward in positive and negative directions depending on what you do with it. I like to make the argument that while anger certainly can lead to all of the things that people in our chat box just mentioned, anger is also an emotion that is incredibly useful for motivation and change. I think the most classic example that I can give to people is the very fact that we are now an independent nation. If we hadn't gotten, I should say our ancestors, if our ancestors hadn't gotten upset about paying taxes without representation 300 years ago, we would still be a British colony. But we got fed up of paying taxes, and so we left. And any number of events in history that have taken place before that and after that, from revolutions to social movements, a lot of these things have been fueled by anger. And none of this has necessarily been just completely linked to violence and aggression. You also have a lot of really strongly positive transformational moments happening because anger was a huge motivator for people to seek change, to seek out better ways of life. So I always like to throw that in when we're talking about anger. And that being said, a couple of other things that we can take from a lot of what the chat box just mentioned, and also some other things that we can look at when it comes to anger. If you ever go into Google, like I had to do when I was making this PowerPoint, and you type in anger into Google Images, there are a couple of common themes that tend to pop up. And just looking at the images that we have in front of us right now, again, I'll turn to the audience very quickly this time. If anyone has anything that they are taking away from some of the similarities in these pictures, feel free to just throw them into the chat box. Okay, starting to see some responses. Violence, yelling, the color red. Oh yeah, actually I hadn't even noticed that before, but yes, absolutely. The color red is repeated again, and war. And someone is also very eagle-eyed mentioning the fact that the bottom right image right here, which if you are just listening to this is a picture of a group of women, that is definitely also something we'll get into in just a second. So, okay, I think that's it for right now. So one of the things that kind of is interesting about the assumptions we have about anger is who we assume is angry. It's also interesting to look at how we depict anger, the consequences that we associate with anger. For instance, if we can see here, the majority of the individuals in these different pictures, and again, if you were also to do your own online search, anger is typically more associated with masculinity than it is with femininity. In a lot of the very traditional gender norms that we have in various cultures around the world, not just in America, anger is a very male emotion. Men are expected to be angry in many situations. Men are often associated with it, whereas women are associated with not expressing anger. And that is an interesting stereotype just in of itself, because really, again, at the end of the day, anger is, again, a universal human emotion. Regardless of what your gender identity is, we all experience it. But the fact that we have come over thousands of years to associate it mostly with men is something that, you know, requires a lot of exploration, especially for individuals who are male identified, who are trying to work on anger management, and how differently that might look to someone else. Another thing that I want to mention here is that, again, like a lot of people in our audience pointed out, anger is almost automatically assumed to be associated with aggression, with acting out, with war, with violence, with destruction, really, at the end of the day. And it is also, I think, remiss of me not to point out that there are also a lot of stereotypes when it comes to anger being expressed by not just, you know, gender, but also by race, by social class, and also by socioeconomic status. So moving on from a little bit of this, the other thing that I think is also super important for me to note is anger is not an emotion that we typically feel just for its own sake. And what I mean by that is, most of the time when we get angry about something, there's usually a direct cause and effect situation happening. Whether that's you being cut off in traffic by a driver on I-95 and you get super upset about that, or, you know, your favorite sports team losing, or you going through a breakup, or you seeing something really triggering and traumatizing on the news. Anger only typically tends to appear after other emotions have been activated. And for many of us, it's much easier to show and display anger than it is to display other emotions that might make us seem more vulnerable. Some of those are listed kind of right down here at the bottom, so to speak, of the hidden part of the iceberg. Stress, hurt, embarrassment, loneliness, exhaustion, fear. I also definitely would like to throw in the words guilt and shame into that different pool of emotions as well. And also, I think another thing that we want to point out, just given the state of the world in 2020, is also just the word trauma. Whether it is one event of trauma or multiple events of trauma, trauma in turn also has a major impact on how we deal with anger. So now that we have kind of come to the realization, I hope, that anger is actually a little bit more of a complicated emotion than maybe we usually give it credit for, I also want to talk about substance use and anger. Now, if we look at this image right here, we have a bunch of different neurological and cognitive aspects of the human brain, specifically with young teenage brains that tend to get impacted when substances are introduced into their life. Just for the sake of today's conversation, I want to focus on these two right here. A, less control of your emotions, and B, worse problem solving. The interesting thing about problem solving is that in order to make solutions happen, in order to make effective and really good long-term solutions happen, the more mental and emotional clarity that you have in the moment of trying to problem solve, typically the better off you come up with more effective solutions. If your mental and emotional clarity is absolutely just not in a good place due to, say in this case, a strong feeling of anger, you're not going to make a super great emotional decision, which in turn is going to impact your problem solving abilities. This in turn also really ties into, again, having less emotional control over yourself. If you're having difficulties with your mood and with your emotions and dealing with them and processing them and even just feeling them at a very basic level, that in turn is going to have a major impact on every single other thing that you do. It's going to impact not just your problem solving, but it's also going to impact your mental health. It's going to impact your impulse control. It's going to impact your memory and your ability to focus. It's going to impact your choices in relationships with other people. It's going to, in some ways, really what it comes down to, have a major impact on your sense of personal safety. And although this image is specifically referring to teen brains and how substance use can impact mood, all of these things also still apply for the adult brain as well. One of the things that is very commonly said, actually, in Alcoholics Anonymous is the term the adult children of AA. And one of the reasons why that is such an accurate statement is not because we are trying to, you know, infantilize anybody or demean anybody, but just because when you are growing up, you know, and let's say a typical teenager might start thinking about experimenting with a substance at maybe around 13, 14, maybe a little bit older than that. Regardless of what substance you put into your body, there are certain physical things that are just going to continue to happen. You're going to continue to grow. You're going to continue to go through puberty. You're going to continue to get taller. You're going to have muscle development, hormonal development. Physically, those things are just going to continue to naturally happen. What stops happening at the age at which you start to use is your emotional and mental development. And we really are beginning to think that a lot of that is just because, again, of all of the impact of these different substances on the emotional regulation parts of the brain, and also the frontal lobe and the frontal parts of the brain that have to do, again, with identity and emotional control and mood regulation. So typically, you might have someone who starts using a substance at, say, the age of 14, and they continuously are using that substance up until, let's say, their early to mid 30s. By the time they get to their early to mid 30s, they are chronologically at that age, emotionally and mentally. They are still stuck being 13, 14 years old. Oh, do I hear someone joining us? Hello? No? Okay. So again, if anyone has any questions.
Oh, hi, Kara. It's Bonnie.
Oh, sorry, Bonnie, you're kind of breaking up. How are you?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. Thank you. I just joined you. I apologize for being late.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Sorry. Okay. So just to get back into what I was saying just a moment ago, when you have that emotional and mental development stop and not pick up again until much later in life, there are so many important things that we are learning how to do when we are in our adolescent and our young adult years that we don't get the opportunity to check in with because substances really have a major interference in that. A lot of that has to do really with what we've talked about already in terms of problem solving, in terms of impulse control and mood. But a lot of it too is also about identity and building up a sense of who you are, what you like, what you don't like, your ability to communicate with people, your ability to have safe boundaries with other people and with yourself. Self-control even, I think, is a major thing that tends to not pop up in our lives until we start to reach our 20s at the least. There are so many different aspects of emotional and mental development, basically in summary, that gets lost with substance use. And unfortunately, one of the long-term consequences that we can see as a result of that is a lot of mental health problems and a lot of difficulties with everything ranging from depression and anxiety to anger and irritability. One of the other interesting things, though, I know we just spent a lot of time talking about the emotional and the mental development piece of all of this, but there are some also very real biological issues that come with your mood and trying to, say, either decrease or completely get sober from the substance that you've been using. One of the things that I like to talk to my clients about in my practice is this thing called post-acute withdrawal symptoms. And the shortened version of that is PAWS. And PAWS is I guess I'm going to summarize it as the healing process that takes place after your initial detox period is over. Let's say you have someone who, for instance, has been abusing alcohol for the past 12 to 15 years, and they end up going to the emergency room, they get admitted to a medical detox where all of the alcohol is just kind of slowly purged out of their body in a safe, controlled medical environment. Now, after that point, even though alcohol is no longer flowing in their system, there is still a lot of damage that has been done at the biological and at the neurological level. Your brain and your body need to take a lot of time to heal after that period. This recovery period can sometimes last for a few weeks, but in other people, I've seen it last for 6 to 8 months, in a few cases, even as long as a year plus. It really does depend on your body, your health conditions, what substances you were using, how long you were using those substances. So this is not going to look the same for every single individual person, but most clients who I have worked with have definitely struggled with pause for at least 3 to 4 to 5 months. And you are having to do a lot of work in that time period around building in some very essential skills with when it comes to things like mood regulation, because if you can't get it done in that time period, and if you wait 6, 8, 12 months to get that work done, whether in therapy or in a support group with medication assisted treatment, whatever your preference is, you are going to be coming out of the treatment world still with all of the emotional coping skills of a 13-year-old. And you're expected to behave as a, again, to use our earlier kind of made up client example, you're expecting to act fully like a 30-something-year-old adult. And it just does not work well if you don't put in the treatment and the focus with your care. So here are some interesting common symptoms of pause. There are a lot of physical ones: aches, pains, nausea. A lot of my clients typically have struggled with insomnia when it comes to pause, loss of appetite, loss of sex drive, difficulties with focusing and concentrating on things. And now we start to get into the emotional and mental piece here. Again, a huge swing up on irritability and anger, depression and anxiety, mood swings, and just generally having low energy. And you can definitely be experiencing all of these things before, removing all of the different substances from your body. And definitely not every single person gets to the point where they are developing post-acute withdrawal symptoms. But for those people who are, in fact, at a point where they could develop pause, these are all of the different things that they might be experiencing, again, in that initial healing process. Which is, frankly, one of the reasons why, there is also another saying for those of us who have done work with people who have struggled with substance use, and that is, sobriety is not the hard part. The recovery period afterwards is the hard part, because that is also the time where you are having to learn a lot about yourself. You're having to process a lot of what you have done to yourself and others in the course of your substance use. And you're also, again, having to learn a lot of new skills very quickly for the first time, which is why substance use treatment is incredibly difficult for a lot of people. But again, if you can manage to get through treatment correctly, the reward potential is extraordinarily high. Now, there are a lot of other trauma factors that can sometimes come up with substance use. Whether that be you getting to the point that you are homeless, financially just not in a stable position, dealing with health issues. There is a huge amount of trauma that comes with living that sort of lifestyle. There may also be other people who don't ever get to that point with their substance use, but maybe instead are turning to substances as a way to actually manage their anger from past trauma histories or from other mental health issues. I've worked with a lot of people, for instance, who have struggled with learning disabilities like ADD and ADHD, who have also in turn developed depression and anxiety from having to deal with the impact of those learning difficulties on their life. And they've turned to substance use as a way of coping with their mood. There are also a lot of people who I've worked with who have just gotten out of the prison system and are either right back on the streets or back home for the first time in years. Maybe they're on parole, probation, maybe they're not, but they are still definitely feeling the trauma from their incarceration history and assorted other aspects of their life often. And they in turn are also using substances, or may end up using substances, just again as a way to cope, because prison unfortunately is not typically the place where you are learning a lot of those coping skills. So again, there is no one way in which someone may turn to a substance, and there is no one way in which someone is going to perfectly learn how to deal with their mood, especially when it comes to something like anger management. But we have one kind of example in front of us right now: how to manage your anger. So we have this guy who has just gotten coffee spilled all over him, and the person with the, I'm assuming, empty cup is looking pretty mortified. So there are a couple of different coping skills on the side here for someone to use in said situation. Talking to somebody else, doing a breathing technique or a muscle relaxation technique, just taking a moment to just walk away from the situation and come back when you've cooled off, taking a walk or going on a run or doing some other form of exercise, reframing the way you're looking at the situation, and also identifying triggers and warning signs for maybe trying to, and kind of helping yourself avoid a negative situation where your anger might get triggered. But I'd also like to turn to our audience tonight and have people just answer in the chat box, what are some other ways in which you manage your anger? And again, I'll just give people a couple of seconds to input some of that into the chat box. So one thing that I'm seeing here is boxing. Yeah, okay. So we have one person who says that they go boxing to deal with anger. I have another person here who's saying that they like to take their dog on a really long walk or a really long hike. I have someone else here who is saying that they like to call someone, like a friend or their family member. Okay, so yes, all very excellent examples of anger management coping skills. And when it comes to dealing with anger management, one of the things that I think is really, really important, especially when it comes to you learning how to regulate your mood when substance use has been so disruptive to you learning how to do anything with your mood, are different types of coping skills. I like to say to my clients, you never want to have just one coping skill to deal with everything that life is going to throw at you. If nothing else, I think most of us have learned that lesson this year in 2020 as things have just continued to evolve, but there are many different types of coping skills. And this lovely little Venn diagram has a couple of different examples. So there are more mindful techniques like meditation, yoga, relaxing. There are mental distraction coping skills like doing something like a puzzle or knitting, doing a puzzle in the crossword section of your newspaper, Sudoku, watching a movie or listening to music. I definitely have a lot of people who use music quite a bit for a coping skill with anger. There are also some self-soothing coping skills, which might be taking a really hot shower or going for a swim just to kind of have the water sensation running over your body. Some other people who might want something a little bit more transportable, I guess is the word I'm going to use here, might have a stress ball that they keep tucked into their purse or their work bag. Someone also might want to pop some candy or some gum into their mouth. We also have here some emotional coping skills, which I will say I think tend to take a little bit more energy at times, depending on how angry you might be, but definitely can be a very appropriate coping skill if you have the focus for it. That could be journaling, it could be art, it could be you basically doing some sort of activity in which to get yourself to a place where you can actually process your emotions in that moment. Another thing that is on here is something called opposite action, which is doing something that is more positive than what it is that you're feeling at that moment. So for instance, instead of getting really pissed off at something and putting your headphones on and listening to super, angry heavy metal music for like 3 hours, instead you might want to turn on Netflix and watch a comedy movie instead. And then last but not least, crisis planning. There are always going to be moments where you are just or hopefully not for everyone, but there may be moments in your life where you're just so angry that none of these other coping skills are going to be enough for you in that moment. And that is why having a crisis plan, having a list of supports that you can contact, it would probably be the best option for you. And again, that could be family, it could be friends, it could be your partner, a therapist, or your psychiatrist, it could be a hotline number. You could get in contact with a crisis team if you felt that your safety was in jeopardy. You could also reach out to your faith or spiritual advisor if you happen to be religious or spiritual. There are a number of different ways that you could go about doing this, but definitely practice makes perfect, and have different coping skills for different situations. For instance, the coping skills that you're going to use when you've just been cut off by 3 people on I-95 is going to look very different from the sort of coping skills you can do when maybe you've had a really bad Zoom work meeting and you're working from home right now, and you can just, turn the computer off for about 5 minutes and then just go off and do something else. So my advice to people is have as many different coping skills as you can possibly fit into your life. It's a little bit like having Batman's utility belt around your waist. I mean, that belt has pretty much everything. You want to have a lot of versatility with what you're using. And also keep in mind that one coping skill might not be enough. Oh, 1 second, my cell phone's going off. A lot of spam calls recently. Anyways, like I was saying, have a variety of different coping skills. And I think the last thing I'll say before we move on to the next section is one of the reasons why I push that message so hard is that when it comes to substance use, a lot of people often find themselves struggling with substance use as their only coping skill. You feel like you're having a terrible day, you're going to use it. You feel like you're having a great day, you're going to use. You're feeling like kind of just on a certain day, you're going to use. In order to really break away from that pattern, again, the more skills that you have, the more variety that you have, the more interesting things that you have in your life, honestly, long term, the easier it's going to be for both anger and other aspects of your mood. Now, one thing that I did want to talk about, and this is generally something that I strongly recommend doing with someone who you trust, is in order to be able to not just have coping skills for dealing with your anger, you want to understand, why am I struggling with anger? We all have different triggers. We all have different things that we know could set us off. And if we are in a position where we are being constantly triggered, and that is in turn increasing our sense of anger and irritability, again, like I said earlier in this presentation, that's going to have an immediate impact on your ability to stay safe and to problem solve effectively, and also to keep your mood in a good place. So there are many different types of triggers and warning signs. It looks very different from person to person, but I have broken them down kind of into 4 different categories: emotional, physical, mental, and other. An emotional trigger or a warning sign could be you start to feel increasingly irritated or distressed when you are around, say, someone who you have a really toxic relationship with. Physically, you might start to notice that you're sweating, your heart is starting to race really quickly, your jaw is clenching so tight you have a toothache. You might also notice getting headaches, migraines, stomach aches, really, again, a variety of different things. Mentally, again, like I was saying earlier, this tends to be more so difficulty with focus and concentration, but also poor impulse control. If you are easily triggered, and that in turn has an impact on your impulse control, what is stopping you from, say, getting into a fight with someone and punching them in the face? Hopefully no one listening to this is actually going out and punching people in the face. But that is a definite possibility, and one that I have actually seen, again, quite a bit as a therapist. The final one, the other category, is something, again, that we tend to speak a lot about in Alcoholics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. People, places, and things. For some people, I have worked with a lot of people who now are sober and in recovery from substances, or at the very least have made a huge change to the way that they are using substances in their lives. And there are certain people that they've had to block out of their lives, for instance. One example would be having to change their phone number because all of their former dealers are still trying to get a hold of them to try and sell them something. Places is another good example. Again, I have a lot of clients who now have to, unfortunately, avoid a lot of their former neighborhoods that they either lived in or spent a lot of time in or have family living there, just because if they were to go to that place, there's a chance that they could run into some sort of situation that would make them unsafe. And again, things. This is where it kind of gets a little bit more broad. I know some people who are triggered by time of year. We do have a lot of seasonal mental health issues up here in New England. I know a lot of people who are triggered by the sight of certain objects, or even the sight of, people behaving out in public, or a certain color car, or, it really is a variety of different things. If you can, though, take the time to really identify as many, again, of these warning signs and triggers as you can, you're able then to make safer decisions. If you can recognize the problem before it evolves into a worse problem, you still have a chance to really back away and keep yourself safe. And this is especially true when we think back to that kind of iceberg picture I had shown you earlier, when we think again about how anger tends to be fueled by other emotions. Again, especially with guilt, shame, and trauma, you want to be very, very aware of those particular triggers. And like I said, again, this is going to look very different from person to person. So again, whether it's you sitting with yourself or you sitting with someone else who you trust, definitely take the time to really come to an understanding of what it is that's going to impact you. And also, whether you are actively using substances or not actively using substances, you want to take that into consideration as well. Especially, let's say, for instance, you might be someone who is starting to decrease your alcohol intake and you're starting to experience some withdrawal symptoms. You are going to know in that moment that you are going to definitely be a lot more on edge and a lot more irritable for probably a considerable period of time, because again, you've just lost, or you're losing, your one real coping skill. So keeping in mind that you might need to keep yourself as stress-free as possible for the first couple of months of you doing that part of your journey is, again, just one example of how you might need to really individualize this to yourself. So kind of in conclusion, and just a nice little neat summary here, anger management practices, again, understand anger is a human emotion. We all feel it. We mostly all feel it multiple times over the course of our lives. And it is not an emotion that we can get rid of without going in and performing brain surgery on people. Anger does not have to lead to negative consequences or decision-making. It can be a motivator, it can be a factor for change, but it does still have that double-sided edge to it, which is, again, why you want to identify your triggers and warning signs, individualize your coping skills to your specific needs, and again, just really be aware of what it is that you are going to need for the different situations that pop up in your life, whether substances remain or leave. A couple of interesting little resources here. I might be a little bit biased in saying this, but as a therapist, I definitely recommend, if you are able to, consider finding a therapist. And if you are totally not into the idea of speaking with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker, or really anyone in the mental health field, there are definitely still some really great resources that you can access out there. Apps are becoming much more popular when it comes to how we are living our lives these days, especially since so much of what we are accessing right now is virtual. Headspace is a really great app. Stop, Breathe, and Think is another one. There's also an app called Smiling Mind. All three of these are free to download off the App Store. And the other nice thing about these apps is that they are not specifically focused on substance use. You can definitely go into depth with certain things that are triggering you with these apps, but really, you could also just stick to them as more traditional mindfulness apps. If you are a little bit more interested in the mental health side of things, the first link up here, therapistaid.com, this is a link to a web page with a lot of worksheets that you can fill out at home that if you are someone who appreciates kind of figuring things out on paper or with questions and answers, this might be a really great resource for you. Psychologytools.com also has an interesting section on anger management techniques. And finally, and this is maybe not something that is going to appeal to every single person, but SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they have this really fantastic anger management workbook that's available online, and it really focuses on anger management through the lens of mental health and substance use. So I can definitely recommend for people who are really willing to delve into that, that might be a really good workbook for you to check out. And again, it's available for free online. So I've done a lot of talking, but again, thank you for everyone participating and chipping in with answers today. It was really great. Now I'm just going to take, again, a couple of minutes and see if anyone else in the audience has any questions that they'd like to ask or anything that we didn't quite get to today. If you want to use your mic, you might want to raise your hand first and just let me know. Or if you want to just go ahead and just start putting questions into the chat box, we can also do that as well. Okay, quiet audience tonight. That's okay. I guess that just means I answered a lot of people's questions. Again, in summary, if you have any feedback for us, again, we still have our Google survey open. We would love to get feedback from people. Please feel free to just go to this link down here below. The survey takes literally like 30, 40 seconds to fill out. And I'll just give people another couple of seconds to write down that training link, the survey link, I meant to say. And then last but not least, please do remember that you can follow us on our social media pages. We upload all of these videos after they've been recorded live on Zoom onto our new YouTube channel. So if there are particular slides that you want to maybe have a bit of a closer look at and didn't quite manage to today, please feel free to go onto our YouTube page. We also post very regularly on Facebook and Instagram. We have a lot of prevention information that goes out on our social media, as well as harm reduction, and overall just letting people know about the accessibility for different treatment resources. So again, please feel free to check us out there. And next week actually is going to be the last in our virtual training series PowerPoints. For right now, I think we're going to be developing a lot more in the future. Next week, please tune in again Thursday at 6 p.m. for our final video, and that is going to be on alcohol. And again, if anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media apps. We would be happy to talk with you further after this.